Harry and Meghan's detractors have been calling for them to be stripped of their HRH since they left the royal family over 5 years ago. But those calls seem to be growing louder and from a more widespread community.
On January 24th, 2026, a father made an impossible choice. King Charles signed a document that erased his youngest son from royal history, not in anger, but in silence. No warning, no explanation. The crown survived. The family shattered. But what did the FBI discover that forced a king to destroy his own child? Stay tuned as we uncover the morning everything changed. The morning of January 24th, 2026, arrived like any other inside the ancient stone walls of the palace. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Footsteps echoed down marble corridors. Tea was poured at precisely 8 o'clock. But something felt wrong. King Charles sat alone in his private study, a room lined with portraits of monarchs who had ruled before him. Men and women who had carried the weight of the crown through wars, scandals, and centuries of change. Now that weight pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than ever before. He was 77 years old. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his reading glasses. The burden of duty had aged him faster than the years themselves. Every decision felt like walking on ice that might crack beneath him at any moment. The door opened without a knock. His principal private secretary entered, face pale and drawn. Behind him came 2 senior diplomats, moving with the kind of urgent quiet that signals crisis. They carried folders marked with red seals, the kind used only when silence was required. Charles felt his chest tighten. The secretary spoke carefully, his voice low and measured. Communications had arrived through multiple channels within the last hour, diplomatic back channels, security services, all pointing to the same source, the Duke of Sussex. Those words hung in the air like smoke. Charles closed his eyes for just a moment, then opened them again. His face remained completely still. The secretary placed the first folder on the desk. There had been developments at the California residence. California residence. 2 simple words that carried an ocean of meaning. Not home, not estate. Residence, clinical, distant. A place that existed outside the reach of the crown, beyond tradition, separated by more than geography. The king's jaw tightened. Information had reached them from Washington and from other allied services. The details were sensitive, delicate, dangerous. Charles looked at the folders but did not touch them. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Harry had always been complicated. As a child, he was bright-eyed and laughing, running through palace gardens with scraped knees and muddy hands. A boy who needed protection, who needed guidance. But that boy had grown into a man Charles barely recognized. A man who had walked away from everything. A man who had chosen another path, another country, another life. And now, a man who might have become a liability. "I want absolute silence on this matter," Charles said, his voice sharp as a blade. "No aides outside this room, no leaks, no whispers in hallways. No one speaks to the press, to staff, or to family. Not yet." "Understood, Your Majesty. How many people know?" "At this moment, fewer than 10. We have contained it thus far." Charles stood from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, London moved forward as it always did. Buses rumbled past, tourists took photographs, ordinary people lived ordinary lives, unaware that inside these walls something was breaking. He thought of Harry again. Not the man who had left, but the child who had lost his mother too young, the boy who had needed him, who had looked up at him with eyes full of trust. That memory should have softened him. It should have made this easier to bear. Instead, it made everything worse. Because a king could not afford to be just a father. A king had responsibilities that reached beyond one son, beyond one family. The crown was bigger than all of them. It had survived for 1,000 years because hard decisions were made when they needed to be made. Charles turned back to face the men in the room. "I want a full sealed report," he said quietly. "Every detail, every source, every implication. Bring it to me within the hour." "Yes, Your Majesty." The men filed out, closing the door behind them with a soft click. Charles was alone again. He returned to his desk and sat down heavily. The folders lay before him, still unopened. He placed one hand flat on the nearest one, feeling the rough texture of the paper beneath his palm. Outside, church bells began to ring across the city, clear and bright, calling people to prayer, marking the passage of time as they had for centuries. Normal life continued. The world turned. People went about their days unaware that anything had changed. But inside this room, something had shifted. The crown had gone silent, and in that silence, a father prepared to do what a king must do, even when it meant fracturing the very thing he had spent his entire life trying to protect. The bells rang on. Charles did not open the folders, not yet, but their presence on his desk was enough. They sat there like poison, seeping into every memory he held of his youngest son, waiting, patient, inevitable. The morning had arrived quietly. The breaking would come soon enough. The file that changed everything. The sealed report sat on King Charles's desk for 3 full minutes before he touched it. His hands rested flat on the polished wood surface, fingers spread wide, as if bracing himself against an invisible force. Outside the windows, London continued its endless rhythm. Cars passed, people walked, the world moved forward, unaware. But inside this room, time had stopped. Charles finally reached for the folder. The red seal broke with a soft crack. He opened it slowly, carefully, like a man handling something that might explode. The first page carried a simple heading. No dramatic flourish, no bold warnings, just a date, a classification level, and 6 words that made his breath catch. Subject: Investigation into Sussex, California operations. Investigation. The word alone was enough to make his chest tighten. This was not family gossip, not tabloid speculation, not rumors passed between staff members over tea. This was official, documented, real. Charles read the opening summary twice, then a third time, certain he must have misunderstood. But the words remained the same: clear, clinical, damning. The investigation had not begun with the palace. It had begun across the Atlantic, triggered by concerns that had nothing to do with royal protocol or family drama. The FBI had become involved not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Patterns had emerged. Communications had been flagged. Connections had been traced. Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was not about Harry making poor choices or embarrassing the family. This was something else entirely. Something bigger. Something that reached beyond personal scandal into territory that made his advisors use words like vulnerability and exposure. He turned the page. The report did not spell everything out in plain language. Instead, it outlined movements and meetings, financial transactions that seemed ordinary until you looked at them together, conversations that appeared innocent until you understood who was listening. Piece by piece, the document built a picture that made Charles feel physically ill. Foreign interests. The phrase appeared multiple times, never quite defined, never quite explained. But the implication was clear enough. Harry had been careless. Harry had been naive. Harry had allowed himself to become surrounded by people whose loyalty was not to him, not to the crown, and certainly not to Britain. Private assurances had been given. To whom? For what purpose? The report did not say explicitly, but the gaps in information were almost worse than the facts themselves. Charles's imagination filled in those blanks with scenarios each more troubling than the last. Unguarded influence. That phrase appeared in a section marked with a small red asterisk, the kind used to signal information requiring immediate attention. Charles read that section 4 times, each reading making his hands shake more visibly. His son, his youngest son, had become a liability without even realizing it. The door to the study opened. Charles did not look up. He knew who it would be. His 3 most senior advisors entered quietly and arranged themselves before the desk like a tribunal. Their faces carried the same grim expression, the same careful neutrality that powerful men use when delivering terrible news. The first advisor spoke, his voice steady and measured. This was no longer a family matter, he said. The situation had evolved beyond that. What had seemed like personal choices and private decisions now carried implications that reached into matters of state security. Charles finally looked up from the report. His face felt numb. The second advisor continued where the first had left off. Protecting Harry had always been complicated, he explained. But protecting Harry now, given what they knew, given what might still be discovered, could actively endanger the institution they were all sworn to preserve. The words landed like physical blows. Charles thought of Harry as a child again, smiling, laughing, running through gardens with his brother, both of them so young, so innocent, so completely unaware of the weight they would one day carry. He thought of Harry at his mother's funeral, walking behind that coffin with his head down, just a boy who had lost everything. But that boy was gone. In his place was a man who had made choices, a man who had walked away, a man who now, whether he intended it or not, posed a risk to everything Charles had spent his life protecting. The third advisor leaned forward slightly. They needed to discuss options, he said quietly. Strategies, responses, ways to contain the damage before it spread. Charles heard the words, but could not quite process them. His mind kept circling back to one simple, terrible truth. His son had become dangerous, not maliciously, not intentionally, but dangerous nonetheless. He closed the report and placed both hands flat on top of it, as if trying to keep the information from escaping the folder and contaminating everything it touched. Disbelief gave way to something worse. Not anger, he had expected to feel anger, had braced himself for rage, but fear. Deep, cold, paralyzing fear. Fear of what might be discovered next. Fear of what the press would do if any of this reached them. Fear of how the public would react, how Parliament would respond, how allies would view them. Fear of watching everything his mother had built, everything his family had preserved through centuries, crumble because one man had been too careless, too trusting, too naive. The advisors waited in silence. They had learned long ago not to rush the king when he was processing information like this. His face had gone pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of catastrophe. If this becomes public, what survives? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. None of the advisors answered immediately. They glanced at each other, each waiting for someone else to speak first, because they all knew the truth. They had known it before entering the room. They had discussed it in hurried, quiet conversations before coming to see the king. If this became public, truly public, in all its detail and implication, very little would survive intact. The monarchy might endure. It had survived worse scandals, though not many. But trust would shatter. Authority would crack. The careful balance of reverence and relevance that kept the crown functioning in a modern world would tip dangerously toward irrelevance. And Harry himself? What would survive of him? Charles did not wait for an answer. He already knew. He stood slowly from his desk, the report still closed beneath his hands, and walked to the window. Outside, church bells were ringing again. The same bells that had rung that morning. The same bells that rang every day, marking time, calling the faithful, reminding the world that some things endure. But inside the palace walls, something had already begun to fracture. And Charles understood now that protecting his son might mean sacrificing everything else. When brothers become strangers. Prince William arrived at the palace without ceremony. No press announcement, no scheduled appointment in the official diary. Just a quiet phone call in the early afternoon and a black car pulling through the gates an hour later. The kind of arrival that signaled a crisis. Charles waited in the same study where he had read the report that morning. The folder now sat locked in a drawer, but its presence still poisoned the air. He could feel it there, hidden but not forgotten, like a wound covered but still bleeding. When William entered, his face was unreadable. He wore a dark suit and moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned long ago to control every visible emotion. His eyes met his father's briefly, then looked away. They did not embrace. Charles gestured to a chair. William sat. The distance between them felt like miles. There was no gentle way to begin, so Charles simply began. He explained what had been discovered. Not every detail, some things were too sensitive even for this conversation, but enough. Enough for William to understand the scope. Enough for him to grasp the danger. William listened without interruption. His hands rested loosely in his lap. His breathing remained steady. But something hardened in his expression with each passing minute, like ice forming over water. When Charles finished, silence filled the room. William did not ask questions. He did not express shock or disbelief. Instead, he sat perfectly still for nearly 30 seconds, processing information the way a strategist processes intelligence before battle. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. He had suspected something was wrong, he said. Not this specifically, but something. Harry had been careless for years, reckless, making decisions without considering consequences, surrounding himself with people who did not understand what it meant to carry royal blood. Charles started to defend his youngest son, an instinct, automatic and paternal, but William raised one hand slightly, stopping him. This was not about defending Harry anymore, William said calmly. This was about protecting the institution, protecting the crown, protecting the next generation. The words landed like accusations. Charles looked at his eldest son and saw something that made his chest ache. William was not speaking as a brother. He was speaking as an heir, as a future king. And in that moment, Charles understood with terrible clarity that the boy who had once idolized his younger brother was gone. In his place sat a man who had learned to calculate risk, measure liability, and make decisions based on duty rather than love. Old wounds surfaced between them without either man speaking them aloud. Years of tension, years of watching Harry break free while William remained bound. Years of duty versus escape, loyalty versus betrayal, sacrifice versus selfishness. William leaned forward slightly. Delay would be dangerous, he said. If this story broke elsewhere, first through leaks, through foreign press, through anyone other than the palace itself, it would look like weakness. Worse than weakness. It would look like incompetence. Like they had been caught off guard, caught hiding something, caught protecting someone who should not be protected. Charles felt his throat tighten. He tried to explain that Harry was still his son, still family, still someone who deserved consideration, who deserved a chance to explain, who deserved something other than immediate judgment. But William's expression did not soften. Harry had made his choices, William said quietly. He had chosen to leave, chosen to speak against the family publicly, chosen to build a life outside the institution while still claiming its benefits. And now, whether intentionally or through sheer negligence, he had created a situation that put everyone at risk. Everyone. William said that word with particular weight. Not just the institution, not just the crown's reputation. Everyone. Meaning William himself, meaning Catherine, meaning their children. Charles felt something break inside him, because William was right. Harry's actions, whatever their intent, whatever justification he might claim, had created indirect risk for people who had done nothing wrong. William's family had remained loyal, had served without complaint, had sacrificed privacy and freedom and normal life for the sake of duty. And now they faced potential exposure to scandal because of someone who had walked away from those same obligations. The injustice of it hung between them like smoke. Charles stood and walked to the window. Outside, tourists gathered near the gates, taking photographs, smiling, treating the palace like a museum piece rather than a living institution. They did not know what was happening inside these walls. They did not know that the family they romanticized was fracturing in real time. William's voice came from behind him, steady and implacable. Keeping Harry's titles now would send a message, he said. It would imply endorsement, or worse, blindness. It would suggest that the crown either approved of what had happened or was too weak to respond. Either perception would be devastating. Charles did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the people beyond the gates, the ordinary lives continuing without pause. He thought about what monarchy meant, what it had always meant: sacrifice, duty. The individual is subordinated to the institution. His mother had understood that better than anyone. She had lived it every day of her reign, making impossible choices, putting the crown above personal feeling time and again. And now he was being asked to do the same. William stood as well. Charles could hear the movement but still did not turn. His eldest son crossed the room to stand beside him at the window, both of them looking out at the same view, seeing different futures. William spoke again, and this time there was something almost gentle in his voice, almost sympathetic. He understood this was difficult, he said. He understood this was painful. But they were running out of time. The world did not pause for family sentiment. The world did not care about the personal cost of royal duty. The crown had to act before someone forced its hand. Those words settled over Charles like a weight. He finally turned to look at his son. William met his gaze steadily, without flinching, without apology. In that moment, Charles saw not the boy he had raised, but the king that boy had become without ever wearing the crown. William was already thinking like a monarch, making calculations that put survival above sentiment, choosing the institution over the individual, becoming exactly what he had been trained to become. And Charles realized with devastating clarity that he had no choice but to follow. Because William was right. Delay meant weakness, inaction meant vulnerability, and protecting Harry, now truly protecting him, shielding him from consequences, might destroy everything they had all sacrificed so much to preserve. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the sun began to set over London. Golden light touched the ancient stones of the palace, the same light that had fallen on these walls for centuries. Monarchs had stood in this very room and made terrible choices before. Choices that cost them sleep, cost them peace, cost them pieces of their souls. Now it was Charles's turn. William straightened his jacket, preparing to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused and looked back at his father. His final words were spoken quietly, but they carried the force of inevitability. The crown must act before the world forces its hand. Then he was gone. Charles stood alone in the fading light, understanding that everything had just changed. The decision had not been made yet, not officially, not formally, but the path forward had become clear, and there would be no turning back. The night a father became only a king. Charles did not sleep. The night stretched endlessly, each hour marked by the distant chimes of palace clocks. He sat in his study with the lights dimmed, surrounded by portraits of monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices. Edward VIII, who had chosen love over duty and spent the rest of his life in exile. Victoria, who had banished family members for lesser scandals. George V, who had changed the family name itself to survive a war. History offered precedent, but no comfort. Charles opened old files and read about abdications, betrayals, and exiles. Each case is different. Each case is the same. Family sacrificed for the crown. Personal feeling subordinated to institutional survival. The pattern repeated across centuries like a curse passed down through blood. He had always known this might come. Some version of this. Some moments where being king and being father would collide so violently that only one could survive. He had just never imagined it would involve Harry. Dawn came slowly. Gray light filtered through windows, turning the study cold and colorless. Charles had barely moved from his desk. Papers surrounded him, constitutional documents, legal precedents, historical analyses, all of them pointing toward the same conclusion. The decision had already been made. Now it only needed to be executed. His legal advisors arrived at 7. They brought revised drafts of the necessary documentation, language stripped down to its essential meaning. Each word had been weighed and measured. Each phrase designed to protect the institution while minimizing personal attack. Charles read through the documents 3 times. "Too harsh," he said. "Soften the language." This was not about punishment. This was about protection. Protection of the monarchy. Protection of what remained. The advisors exchanged glances but made the changes. They understood what he was trying to do. Frame this as necessity rather than retribution. Present it as institutional preservation rather than family conflict. But no amount of careful language could disguise what this really was. A father destroying his son's identity. The revised documents came back within the hour. Charles read them again, searching for some way to make this less brutal. There was none. The legal requirements were clear, the constitutional implications unavoidable. Stripping titles required specific language, formal structure, and official procedure. There was no gentle way to erase someone from royal history. Charles thought about calling Harry, picking up the phone, explaining, warning him, giving him a chance to respond, to defend himself, to offer some explanation that might change the outcome. But he did not. That silence became its own form of cruelty. Charles understood this even as he chose it. By not calling, he was denying Harry even the dignity of knowing what was coming. But calling would mean an argument, pleading, emotion that might weaken his resolve. And he could not afford weakness now. The morning of January 24th moved forward with mechanical precision. Staff came and went. Meetings occurred. The machinery of monarchy continued its endless operation while Charles sat at the center of it, preparing to sign away his son's birthright. The final document was placed before him at exactly 9:30. It looked ordinary, just paper and ink, official letterhead and formal language, nothing that suggested the devastation it would cause. Charles picked up his pen. His hand trembled slightly. He set the pen down and flexed his fingers, willing them to steadiness. A king's signature could not waver. History would examine this document for generations. Analyze the handwriting. Look for signs of hesitation or doubt. He could show neither. Charles picked up the pen again. This time his hand remained steady. He read the opening lines one final time. Formal phrases about institutional integrity. Careful language about protecting the crown. Not a single word of anger. Not a single reference to what Harry had actually done. Just the cold machinery of constitutional action. Charles touched pen to paper. The moment was quiet, almost clinical. No drama. No witnesses beyond the two advisors standing at respectful distance. Just a man signing a document in a room that had seen 1,000 similar moments across centuries. But the meaning was devastating. With each stroke of the pen, Charles was erasing his son from official royal life, removing titles that Harry had carried since birth, severing connections that bound him to family, to history, to identity itself. The signature completed, Charles set down the pen. It was done. He felt nothing at first, just numbness. The protective emptiness that comes when emotion would be too much to bear. He stared at his signature on the page, at the formal language surrounding it, at the official seals that would be applied later. This was how it ended. Not with shouting or tears, not with confrontation or explanation. Just paperwork, just a procedure. Just the quiet violence of bureaucracy doing what emotion could not. One of the advisors stepped forward and carefully collected the signed document. It would be processed now. Recorded. Filed. Announced. The world would know soon enough. Charles remained seated at his desk long after the advisors had left. The room felt emptier than before, colder, as if something vital had been removed from the air itself. He had done what William said must be done, what the institution required, what history would likely judge as necessary. But he had also done something else. He had chosen the crown over his son, and that choice, signed and sealed and official, would define him forever. Not as the king who protected the monarchy during a crisis, but as the father who could not save his child. History would judge him as both. Charles suspected it would forgive neither. When the world stops calling your name. The email arrived at 11:43 in the morning, California time. Not a phone call, not a family member's voice. Just a formal notification from London legal offices, clinical and distant, informing Prince Harry that certain decisions had been made regarding his status within the royal household. Harry read it 3 times before the meaning fully registered. His titles were gone. Not suspended, not under review, gone. Removed by official decree, processed through constitutional channels, signed and sealed and irreversible. The formal language tried to soften the blow with phrases about institutional integrity and necessary measures, but the reality underneath was simple. He had been erased. Harry set down his phone and stared at nothing. The California sun poured through windows, bright and indifferent. Outside, palm trees swayed in the breeze. Cars passed on distant roads. Normal life continued while his own collapsed in silence. He had expected anger when this moment came, rage, the hot, fierce emotion that had fueled so many decisions over the years. But what he felt instead was something colder and more devastating. Absence. Like something vital had been cut away, leaving only empty space where identity used to be. The titles had never been just words. They were connected. History. Proof that he belonged somewhere, to something, to people who shared his blood and his burden. Now that proof was gone. Harry's advisors began calling within minutes. They had been monitoring London news feeds and legal filings. The decision had been announced officially an hour before the email reached him. The world already knew. Press outlets were already running stories. Social media was already exploding with reactions, and he had learned about it last. The calls came faster. Advisors wanted strategy sessions, crisis management, statements to release, positions to take. Everyone had opinions about what he should say, how he should respond, what narrative would play best in the court of public opinion. But Harry barely heard them. His mind kept circling back to one terrible realization. His father had not called. William had not called. No one from the family had reached out to warn him, to explain, to offer even the pretense of conversation. They had simply moved on, cut him loose, decided he was expendable, chosen the crown over the son, the brother, the man who had once been third in line to inherit everything they were protecting. The isolation was total. Within hours, fragments of another story began emerging. Whispers about an investigation, vague references to FBI involvement. Nothing concrete, nothing Harry could confirm or deny. Just enough to create speculation, to plant seeds of doubt, to make people wonder what he had done to deserve this. Fear crept in alongside the numbness, because Harry understood now what was happening. The palace was not just removing his titles. They were preparing a narrative, building a case in the court of public opinion, making him toxic before he could defend himself. And if he tried to fight back, if he spoke publicly, if he tried to explain his side of whatever story they were constructing, he might only make things worse, confirm suspicions, give credence to accusations he did not fully understand. He felt trapped. Defending himself meant exposing details he did not want exposed. Remaining silent meant accepting whatever version of events others chose to tell. Either path led to destruction. His allies began disappearing. People who had promised support suddenly stopped returning calls. Organizations that had partnered with him issued careful statements about reviewing their relationships. Friends who had stood beside him through previous scandals now claimed they needed time to understand the situation before commenting. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone the crown had publicly rejected. Harry thought about the old grievances, the years of feeling like a spare, the resentment at always being second, the anger at a system that valued order over individuality. Those feelings had justified so many choices, given him permission to break away, to build something separate, to claim a life on his own terms. But now those grievances offer no comfort, because the truth was unavoidable. The monarchy had chosen survival over reconciliation, had decided that protecting the institution mattered more than protecting him. And all his anger, all his justified complaints about being mistreated and misunderstood, meant nothing in the face of that cold calculation. He had wanted freedom from the royal machine. Now he had it, complete and total, but it felt less like liberation and more like exile. Harry walked through his California house as afternoon faded into evening. Rooms that had once felt like refuge now felt like prison. This was supposed to be his fresh start, his new life, his chance to be something other than a royal spare. Instead, he was just alone. Without the titles, without the family, without the institution he had spent years resenting, Harry faced a question he had never seriously considered. Who was he? Not Prince Harry anymore. That identity had been officially revoked. But also not just Harry. because being just Harry required building something from nothing, creating meaning without the framework that had defined him since birth. He stood at a window and looked out at the fading light. Somewhere across an ocean, in a palace he would probably never enter again, his father and brother were moving forward, making decisions, protecting what they believed needed protecting. And he was here, untethered, unmoored, facing a future that stretched forward without shape or direction. The price of survival. The world reacted within hours. News spread across continents like wildfire. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Social media exploded with opinions. Every news outlet, every commentator, every person with access to the internet had something to say about the Crown's decision to strip Prince Harry of his titles. The reactions were swift but divided. Some praised King Charles for protecting the institution, for making the hard choice that duty required, for showing that the monarchy still had standards, still had boundaries, still demanded loyalty in exchange for privilege. Others condemned him as cruel, heartless, a father who had abandoned his son when he needed protection most. They called it revenge disguised as responsibility, personal grievance masquerading as constitutional necessity. The truth, as always, fell somewhere between the extremes. The monarchy stood, that much was certain. The decision had been made, announced, and defended through official channels. Constitutional experts confirmed its legality. Historical precedent supported its implementation. The institution had survived another crisis, but it had also changed. Something fundamental had shifted in how the world viewed the royal family, not as untouchable symbols above ordinary human struggle, but as people capable of the same brutal choices that ordinary families made. Capable of choosing survival over sentiment, capable of cutting away their own to save themselves. The crown had protected itself, but it had lost something in the process. Some measure of mystique, some fragment of the fantasy that royalty meant something better, something nobler than the cold calculations of power. King Charles appeared in public 3 days after the announcement, a scheduled engagement at a children's hospital. He smiled at the right moments, shook hands, spoke warmly to families, performed his role with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 77 years learning how to wear a mask. But those close to him saw the truth. He was hollowed out. Not broken breaking would have been too dramatic, too obvious. Just emptied, as if some vital part of him had been removed, and what remained was just the shell performing necessary functions. At night, alone in his private rooms, Charles sat in silence. No reading, no music, just stillness. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to do except endure the weight of choices that cannot be unmade. He had done what had to be done, saved the institution, protected the crown, ensured that the monarchy would survive this crisis and continue into the next generation. But the cost was more than he had anticipated. Because titles could be stripped, official roles could be removed, constitutional connections could be severed with signatures and seals. But blood could not. Harry was still his son. That fact remained unchanged by any document, any decree, any official action. And Charles understood now that this decision would define his reign more than any ceremony or achievement or diplomatic success. History would remember him not for what he built, but for what he destroyed. Not for who he protected, but for who he cast away. William stepped forward in the days that followed, not dramatically, not with any obvious grab for power or attention, just subtly, naturally, the way a man steps into space that opens before him. He attended meetings that Charles once handled alone, made decisions that previously required royal approval, began carrying weight that belonged to tomorrow but could not wait. The transition was already beginning, not officially, not formally, but undeniably. William was becoming what he was always meant to become, and Charles was fading into what all monarchs eventually became. History, memory, a name in the long line of names stretching back through centuries. The family did not gather after the announcement, no meeting to process what had happened, no conversation to make sense of the fracture. They simply continued existing in separate spheres, connected by blood and title but separated by choices too large to bridge. Catherine supported William quietly, as she always had. The children asked questions their parents answered carefully, revealing only what innocence could bear. The extended family issued no statements, maintained careful silence, and went about their duties as if nothing fundamental had changed. But everything had changed. The shape of the family itself had been altered. Not just by Harry's absence, but by the manner of his removal, by the coldness of procedure, by the fact that power had been chosen over mercy, institution over individual, crown over heart. Charles understood this in the quiet hours when sleep would not come. He had made the choice every monarch before him had been forced to make at some point, sacrificing the personal for the political, the human for the historical, the father for the king. The crown had survived, the institution remained intact, the monarchy would continue into the next generation, protected and preserved. But the family would not heal. Some wounds were too deep, some choices too brutal, some fractures too complete to ever fully mend, and Charles would carry that knowledge for whatever time remained to him. He stood at a window one evening, watching London lights spread across the darkness. Millions of people living ordinary lives, making ordinary choices, free to love their children without weighing constitutional consequences, free to protect their families without calculating institutional risk, free in ways a king could never be.